Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today I decided to bring this video which I've been wanting to make for a while because it's a topic that I find really interesting, and I feel like it's going to be important for a lot of beginners to intermediates or even advanced React developers. And what I'm going to go over in this video is a crash course about the context API. As you might know, the context API is like a big part of React as a whole, and a lot of people use the context API. However, a lot of people also misuse the context API. So for that reason, in this video, I'm going to not only show you guys how to use context inside of your project, the reasons why you might want to use it inside of your project, and also what you shouldn't be doing if you end up choosing to use context in your project. So with that in mind, if you could leave a like in the video, I would massively appreciate it. And let's get into the tutorial. Okay everyone, so the first thing I want to talk about is just give a brief explanation on reasons why you might want to use the context API. So the context API is a state management solution provided by React, which allows us to create what is known as a context, and the context provide values like states and functions that can be consumed by a group of components that are wrapped around the context. Basically, the idea is, if you had an example like this, you have a tree of components. Imagine our app starts over here with this component. We have three components over here: a parent, a child, and a grandchild. Now, this situation is very common. You have a state or something on the top component, which is this one over here, the parent, and the state, in our case, is like a username, right? So I want to display the username inside of here. And the problem is I want to change the value of the username on the grandchild component, this one over here. So the issue with that is that I can't create this state inside of the grandchild, because if I did this, I wouldn't have access to username on the parent. And you can't throw states or information up on the tree. You can only pull it down by for example, using props, right? So what you would do without the context API is you would do something like this, right? You would create the state on the top one, like top highest component, display the username, so it would say PedroTech. Then you would call the child component and pass the set username as a prop to it. Then the child component would get that set username, would do basically nothing with it. It doesn't need to know it doesn't need this prop. It just gets it because now it needs to pass one more level down so that the grandchild receives it and then has like a button that when you click on it, it will change the username. So this is called prop drilling. I have a full video on this, and this is one of the issues that the context API kind of aims to solve. Because the reason why we don't do this is because, first of all, this over here, if the set username function is used, or if we pass the username as well and that this state value changed, then this component would have to re-render because now this has changed, and if a prop changes in your component, the component will re-render. So you're unnecessarily re-rendering some components that you're passing down the props, right? And not only that, but you're also making your app really unorganized, because you should try to obsess with code quality. You should try to make your components be as organized as possible. And in this case, what you're doing here is you're receiving a prop to this component that doesn't need that prop, because this prop is kind of like a dummy prop. It just passes down to another component, meaning that with this is an anti-pattern. You shouldn't be doing this if you are having a really well organized project in your application. Now, how could we solve this using the context API? Well, the issue isn't even as bad in this situation because you're just drilling through one component. But the thing is, imagine if you have some sort of app which you have, for example, a state called user, and that state holds information about the user who is logged in. Well, you kind of want that information almost everywhere inside of your app. So it's very likely that what you would have to do in that case is you would have to create that user state on the app component, or in the app, like the highest level component in your app, and then have to pass that as props to all the components. And if you're doing that, it's horrible, because it means that every time your user changes, all the components in your app will have to re-render, even though they don't need to. necessarily, right? So, and also not to mention the fact that it is super annoying and will make your code super messy. So that's what the Context API and any other state management library is trying to solve, right? Create an easy way for you to organize your states and manage your states throughout your application. So Context API is just a way to do this. It's a way to solve this. And the way we use the Context API to solve something like this would be by, first of all, coming over here at the top and importing the create context function in React. Now, it's super simple to set this up. All you have to do is you have to create a context for every group of components that you want to have access to the same states. So I would call this something like app context, or you can call whatever you want. You can create multiple contexts as well. I'll show you more about that later in the video, but I'm going to call this app context. And then I'm going to set this equal to create context, like this. Then what we can put inside of here is a default value for our context. What does that mean? Well, our context will have a bunch of values inside of it. And values are basically all the different things that we want to pass in that context so that the components inside of that context will have access to it. So in our case over here, if we were to pass both the username and the set username, those are two things that we would give to the context and pass it inside of its value, because those are two things that we might want to have access to inside of this whole component tree. So in our case, we could do something like coming over here and saying username equals to an empty string, because that's the initial value of our context, and then say something like set username is equal to, I don't know, you put like a function because this is a function. But what I usually do is, depending, it's recommended to do this, especially because it's good for testing, but you could also just pass null to this and it should be fine. So what we do now is we have this context thing over here. And what this allows us to do is create a context provider. Now, a context provider is just, imagine it as like a component which you just pass around and wrap around all the components that you want to have access to, the values inside of the context, and whatever is inside of this context provider will have access to all of the values you pass to it. So if I came over here and said app context.provider on our parent component and also say app context.provider like this, what happens is now we can pass a property to this which is called value, and whatever we put inside of this value object over here is something that now all the components that are inside of this provider, so the child is included and the grandchild is included because it is inside of the provider, will now have access to it by using the use context hook. So I can just pass username here and set username like this. And now whatever is inside of here will now have access to these values without having to pass any props. So I'll just delete this props over here like this because we don't need them anymore. I'll delete it from all of them, and I'll show you guys how you would get the set username on our grandchild, right? Because now since we removed the prop, how would we get it? Well, we could use something called the use context hook. And obviously I'm doing all of this in one file, but imagine how more organized all of this would be and how all of this would look if you were working in a real project and separating everything into multiple files. But in our case, we can just grab the use context hook, and on our grandchild over here, which is where we want to grab one of the values that we pass to the provider, we can just say const, then open and close curly braces, set it equal to use context, and then just pass the app context over here, because you might have multiple contexts inside of your application. So you need to specify which one you want to get the values from. So now what we can do is we can just decide inside of this grandchild what values from here that we passed we want. In our case, the grandchild only wants to know only wants the set username function, which is something we are passing. So I can just put over here set username, and now it would continue working perfectly without having to pass any props to any of the components, and also not having to drill specifically any props through the grandchild component. Now the grandchild component can do whatever it wants without needing to have access to set username. Also, the Context API isn't just useful for situations where you have a tree of components that is kind of vertical. It also helps to prevent messiness when you have a bunch of sibling components like this. Imagine both the childs, we have two components, which is child1 and child2, and each of them have their own purpose. One of them just displays the username state that we created, and the other one just changes the username. And so what the context API can do is prevent us from having to pass the same prop, or having to pass props to each of them. Because now what we have is each of them can just grab whatever they want from the context by using the use context, and we don't have to pass prop to them. Now, this looks simple, right? This looks really good. It's way simpler than Redux or any other state management solution that I've seen, but there are some stuff that you do need to think about, and that's one of the main purposes of this video. I'm going to go over some of the best practices of what I think you should do if you're going to be using the context API. So the first thing that I want to talk about, which I feel like is best practice, is whenever you choose to actually create a context and use context inside of your project, I would recommend creating a component for each context provider that you create. So for example, imagine we have an app which you can log in and log out as a user, and you have like user information, and you need that information throughout the whole website, right? A lot of social media websites are like this because you might need the username for the user in many parts of your website. You might need the user ID, you might need, I don't know, their profile picture, whatever, right? So this would be a good use case because you would create a component called user context provider, which inside of here, you would create your user context, but it would have to be outside of the component in itself because you need to access this elsewhere. Whenever you do the use context, remember you need to access the context you created. So you create it outside of a component so that you can access in many files. But then inside of this component, all you do is you have one prop called children, and all it does, it just returns the provider and puts everything that you wrap around it inside of the provider. Now, this makes your code look more organized because now I can put everything related to the context inside of this component instead of having it inside of another component that also has UI stuff, right? We're just separating the logic from the UI. Now, the example I came up over here, obviously all of this code is fake, like nothing works, but it would look something like this. You would put everything related to the user inside of here, including, for example, API calls and handling the data. So we would have two states, one for keeping the information about the user and one to keep track if the user is authenticated or not. We could have functions, right? We could have a login function, which makes some sort of API call and then changes the user information based on that. Or a logout function, which does the exact same thing, but just logs the user out. Then we would have a value object with all of the information that we might want to access everywhere in our project. And finally, we would just pass that information or this value inside to the provider, and now everything that we wrap this around will have access to this. So instead of directly wrapping this around the components that we want to have access to the context, I would go over here, for example, and I would wrap the whole app around, or wherever we want to put this context, I would wrap everything around the user context provider component that we created. So it would look something like this, and we could put whatever we want inside of here. So all we're doing is we're just organizing your code better, right? And I would recommend doing this. Whenever I use context API, I always do this, and you do this for each context that you create, and it would just make your code look way more organized. Okay, so now that I spent a lot of time talking about all the benefits and good parts of the context API, you might think that you should probably use this everywhere in your app, and it should probably be your primary state management solution. However, I'm here to say that there are a lot of negative parts of the context API, and I really want to address it. So the main issue with it, and it's something that for some reason a lot of people don't even know, and they use the context API. Like, people use the context API for their project and misuse it all the time without even knowing that this is actually something that happens. And what I'm talking about is the fact that if you have an application such as this one over here, right? We have a very similar example, similar to the ones I already showed you. We have a parent component, and there are 4 child components inside of this application, right? So child 1 is the same we saw before. It just displays a username, which is a state we created on the parent. And then child 2 just changes the username, and that's its main purpose. Then the thing is, child 3, there's another state called count, and it's just completely unrelated to username. It is just a number that you can increase, decrease, whatever you want. And we can pass it both count and set count over here. so that we can use it in the third and fourth component in this tree. Now, the third one, all it does is it just displays the count, and the fourth one, it just increases the count by 1 every time you click on a button. I should probably also change this to change count instead of change username. But yeah, you get what this means, right? We have 4 components. All of them are siblings to each other, and they all have their own purpose, right? One is just to display the username, one is to display the count, one is to change the username, and one is to change the count. Now, this is a very simplistic analogy to a real-world project, which would involve a lot of components, not just 4, and a lot of components that are branching off each other, and with higher complexity and everything that a real project would encompass. But in this case, you can already see one of the negative parts of the context API, because if I were to change the value of username, right, we would imagine that the only component that would re-render is child 1, because it's the only one that needs to see the new value of username, so it displays the new value of username. But that's not the case, because when one single value of the context changes, the whole context technically changes, meaning that every component that is using this context, meaning every component that has the use context hook being called, will have to re-render as well. So if I change the count over here, right, I just increment it by 1. Every time I change the count, all the components in this context will re-render, which is crazy because it is completely unnecessary, because many of them don't even access count, meaning they don't need to re-render. Now, this will probably not be that important if you have a project as simple as this one over here, but like I mentioned many times on my channel, and like I mentioned many times in this video, you should be obsessing over your code quality, and more importantly, you should be obsessing over the velocity and the performance of your project in a real-world scenario. And this over here would be horrible, because it would be causing too many unnecessary renders and just decrease the performance of your website, right? So this is the main issue with the context API, right? So people misuse it all the time because they allow this to happen. Now, I'll show you guys an example of using a provider that would probably cause this issue. So this would be an example of a provider-like component, like I showed you guys previously, that we would create that would be misusing the context API. So I created one for example, a profile page in your website. You probably want to create a state management solution for that case, right? Because a profile page can include many things. For example, it could include a component displaying the user current information. So like if it's your profile page, you're going to be seeing your personal information. Also, maybe you can click on a button and it will open a modal that would allow you to edit your profile information. So you can change your name, you can change your, I don't know, your email or whatever. So you would probably have to create a state called isOpenUpdate model, and it would be called isOpenUpdate modal, and it would probably be a boolean so that you can know if it's open or not. Also, you might want to be able to display your current list of friends, right? If you're looking at your profile, you want to see your list of friends. Just picture like Instagram or Facebook or whatever. In each person's profile, you can see their friends. Now, you know, since you're updating your profile information, if you're the owner of that profile page, you might want to create a state containing the new values that you want to update, which can then be used to, I don't know, make an API call and update that value in a database or something, right? So we created all of the states and we are just passing them through the context, and we would probably, similar to the user context provider that we created previously, we would probably be using this throughout the whole component tree of the profile page. I made a little diagram that would explain how this page would kind of look like, right? It would be like this. It would have so the profile.js would be the main component. It would be the page in itself, probably what you call when you go to that route. Then you'd probably have a profile display.js, which would be a component which does display the information about the current profile info. Then you would probably have the update modal, which would appear based on if you click on a button or not, and the list of friends component, maybe on the right over here, being displayed, right? So this is just to show you guys, and you guys have a picture of how this would work. If we did it this way, there would cause a lot of issues because of the following. First of all, every time one of these values changes, all of the components in this tree would re-render, right? So every time, for example, your information changes or you update your profile, everything, including this list of friends, which has nothing to do with your personal information, would have to re-render, right? But most importantly, we have a state over here called new profile info, and this would probably change very often, because this is something that would keep track of, for example, what you're writing on some sort of input, right? If you're changing your username, it would keep track of what the value of the input is, right? So it would be constantly updating, meaning that all of the components in this tree would constantly be updating as well. And if you're working on an application that has data that is constantly changing, this can be super dangerous because it will definitely decrease the performance of your website. So what am I saying here? Well, I'm saying that if you have states that are constantly going to change, it is better not to put them inside of a context. A context can be very useful for situations in which your state won't be constantly updating, because that will cause the least amount of unnecessary re-renders. Also, putting stuff like this doesn't make sense because, like I mentioned, this will trigger as many re-renders as it can get, right? Not to mention this as well. If you keep just opening and closing the modal, it would continue triggering re-renders for everywhere in the component tree. Meaning, I would recommend these two states to be removed because they can exist in their own components, and even if you need to access them in another way, sometimes, and hear me out, sometimes prop drilling is better than causing unnecessary re-renders like this. So that's something you should use your own judgment towards, but I feel like in this case, it would be good to just remove this and this. And probably this. Actually, it depends on what you want to do. Maybe add some other stuff here that also doesn't change much. But the important thing to notice is that you should be using context only for situations in which your states aren't updating consistently. So what would be a situation like this? Something like this over here would be a good example or a good use case as well. So what we can see over here is we have another user context provider. And the important thing to notice is all of the states that we have over here and all the states that we're passing through the value of the context, they're all states that are necessary throughout the application. So it is important that we're making them kind of global states, but at the same time, they're not going to be changing a lot. Like I said, like you won't be changing a lot of who you are as a user. So the information inside of the user state should not change much. Also, logging in and logging out, like it shouldn't change at all. Like unless you're actually logging in and logging out of the website, which then it doesn't make, you don't need to, like it will re-render anyways, the website, right? Because a user who's logged in should have a different experience as a user who's not. Also, the user who is premium and not premium, I guess like unless you're buying a premium membership to a website and then canceling it like every 5 seconds, this shouldn't change a lot, right? So it's another good thing to have and pass around inside of a context, inside of your whole application. So this could be something that you wrap around most of your app so that throughout your whole app, you could have your own context provider for information related to the user. Also, I know I've kind of made it obvious throughout the video because I've used different examples of contexts, but you can have multiple contexts inside of your project. I came up with this example over here of a more complex website. As you can see, we have an app, right? We have multiple components. We have routes, which in itself each have components that branch off to other components. You can analyze this. It's a simplistic but good view of how a website would normally work. Obviously, I didn't include everything, but you just know that here we would have to have a lot of different states, and we really wouldn't want every component to re-render just because a single state on the edit profile component changes, right? We don't want to trigger everything to re-render just because one single thing over here changes its value. So what we could do is create multiple contexts, right? We could create one for the whole application called app context, which keeps tracks of stuff like maybe the ID of the user who's logged in, maybe, I don't know, whatever, stuff that doesn't change much but is necessary throughout the whole app. Then in the profile, you could create a context for that as well, like a profile context, and then a post context, and then a friends context. And each of them only exists inside of this group of components and this group of components. And that means that it doesn't matter what changes inside of here, stuff around the app won't re-render based on that. Now, is that the best approach? Well, it's a better approach than just creating one context and passing everything inside of it, but it still causes issues because like I said, in the profile example, right, this is almost the same thing as I showed you in that example. If something changes over here, it can still unnecessarily trigger a bunch of re-renders inside of the profile component. And you really want to minimize that to the minimum level, right? You really don't want, even though it's just a small amount of components, you don't want to be causing this to happen. So what are some alternatives? Well, there are multiple alternatives to state management in React. There's actually too many alternatives in my opinion, but we know that we have the context API as one of the options, but we also have stuff like Redux and Redux Toolkit, which are really good alternatives if you want to. They have their benefits and they have negatives to them as well. I personally don't use Redux. I've used Redux Toolkit a lot in the past. I have videos on it, but it's still not the best solution in my view. It's just my personal experience because I include stuff like developer experience and bundle size into the equation, right? And from everything that I've tested, I don't like Redux Toolkit as much as a lot of people do. There's also other libraries like Recall and Zustand. There's a lot of alternatives, right? My approach to it is the following. And also you can disagree. You can do whatever you want. You can even use Redux if you want to. But the way I like to do it is if I'm creating an application that doesn't use GraphQL, which is what most of you guys will probably be creating, I would use the context API for global states such as the ones I mentioned. So like user information, the theme of the application, stuff that doesn't change much, and I will make it exist around the whole part of the application. Then I would use some sort of fetching library like the SWR library or React Query, which I love, by the way. They have some sort of state management solution in itself. They have good solutions for caching, and they're really good because the data you get back from API requests using that library should be the states on their own. So you wouldn't create a state to represent that data. You would use those as the state to inside of your application. And then what I would do is whenever I have a group of components that need some sort of state that exists at a parent and now it needs access to it in a grandchild, I would probably just prop drill, because although I criticize it a lot and it is something that you should avoid, it is not the worst thing in the world, right? Even the React team knows this because it's not the worst thing in the world. It is an anti-pattern, but sometimes you might have to do it. But I put an emphasis on the sometimes because you can always find a way to create and organize your components such that you wouldn't need prop drilling and you wouldn't need the context API for that case, right? So I would say just focus on organizing your project better. Use context for global states, and inside of smaller groups of components, use React Query, SWR, and try to use custom hooks as well as much as you can. Those will help a lot. Now, if I was using GraphQL, because I said this was what I would do without GraphQL, I would probably just do the exact same thing, but instead of using React Query or SWR, I would use some sort of GraphQL fetching library, such as Apollo client, maybe like Relay. I don't know. I like to use Apollo client a lot. That's why I mentioned it first, but that's what I would probably do. So this is basically it for the video. I also plan on making another state management video later on, not this week, but probably later on. Not focused completely on context API, but just to talk about this whole topic, which is massive. And there's a lot to talk about. So that's basically it. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to check out the code, it will all be in the description, together with all the examples that I created and all of the diagrams. I really appreciate you watching this video. If you watched it all the way through, I'm really happy that you did. Let me know your opinions. Let me know so let's have a discussion in the comment section. And a lot of people might disagree with my approach. A lot of people might agree with my approach. I just want to know from you guys. And yeah, that's basically it. I really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I see you guys next time.